Okay, so now we're looking for experimental evidence. This comes from Hawkins and Hattori 2006, and again with our native speakers of Japanese who have learned English. And we're looking for their knowledge of WH and within it, attract closer / superiority effects. Now, interestingly, the restriction on attract closer is stronger with arguments than adjuncts. So when we example like 6, where the WH movement is of an adjunct, you can have two different interpretations. To understand what we're talking about, scope becomes important. When we interpret it as being a WH in the matrix clause, we call that matrix scope. When we interpret it in the embedded clause, that would be embedded clause scope. Here, with the adjunct when, I can get both. And this is because it's an adjunct. When did Sophie's brother warn Sophie would phone who? Now, this is multiple WH, so the who is also there. But since when is sort of our WH that's moved, I can have either of the question can be responded to with when was the brother warning, or when was the brother warning someone, or when was Sophie going to phone? Okay. However, with our arguments, like who, we don't have this optionality. We have to have scope in the matrix clause due to movement. So who did Sophie's brother warn Sophie would phone when? Our only possible answer is scope in the matrix clause, where who is the person who's warned. Okay. We don't have the option of the embedded clause where who gets phoned. Okay. What we want to know is if a second language learner of English has evidence of WH movement, do they also have evidence of this distinction? Are they allowing when in both places, interpretation, both scopes, in 6 but not in 7? With who? And the question is, how do you test that knowledge? Now, Hawkins and Hattori, again, these are Japanese speakers of English. They're going to use JSE as the acronym, and we're also going to use it. This essentially means L1 Japanese, L2 English. But Japanese speakers of English is what JSE stands for. They do what they call a truth value judgment task, but it's essentially it's an interpretation task with a sentence choice. This is the context for the questions you just saw. Sophie was angry. Her holiday had been ruined because the hotel she'd booked through a travel agency was full, and she had to sleep in a tent. Sophie's brother was a friend of Norman, who owned the travel agency. He spoke to Norman on Thursday and told him that Sophie would be phoning his manager, Mrs. Smith, the following day to ask for her money back. Question. Who did Sophie's brother warn Sophie would phone when? Now notice, because there's a potential parsing problem there, I have to use intonation to distinguish, right? Who did Sophie's brother warn Sophie would phone when? Right, phone is the verb to call here. Okay. So there's 3 possible answers that they provide, and the participants in this particular study basically said yes or no to each one. So they could either say yes, 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 no, 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 yes, etc. Answer 1. He warned Sophie's brother, Norman, that Sophie would phone on Friday. He warned that Sophie would phone Mrs. Smith on Friday. He warned Norman on Thursday that Sophie would phone. Okay. Let's look at this in terms of traces and scope. So here, to help us out, I have marked the who that has matrix scope in blue and the embedded scope as red. Keep in mind when is still here because it's multiple WH. And when, I remember Thursday is the day that he warned Norman, and Friday is the day that she was going to call. So we get, so if we have matrix scope, we get Norman as your answer. If we have embedded scope, we get Mrs. Smith. You'll notice that 1 and 2 differ only in which who is answered. And number 3 has matrix scope, but it also, the when also has matrix scope, right? Which, considering it hasn't moved, is really weird, right? So let's look at these 3 answers. And according to the authors, answer 1 is ideal. C should attract the closest WH, which is who. This means that who should have scope in the matrix clause because it's moved, right? And since nothing is attracting when, it should have scope in the embedded clause. Now, number 2, and all 3 of these are plausible given the context. That is the goal of this study. In answer 2 violates attract closest, aka superiority. So in answer 2, who takes scope in the embedded clause? Which would suggest the C hasn't attracted it due to being closer, which just, it makes no sense. So if someone chose answer 2, they've chose something with an attract closer or superiority violation. And answer 3 also violates attract closer, but in some sense worse, because when is what's taking scope in the, well, they're both taking scope in the matrix clause. And if when has somehow moved, then C didn't attract who, C attracted when. Answer 3 is pretty nonsensical in terms of movement, because there's not enough C's to attract all of these things that have matrix scope. Okay? All right, so when this was tested, let's talk about the methods. The participants, after they culled from their original data set of 39 JSEs and 19 natives of English, were 19 JSEs and 11 control English natives. Now, participants were only included if they met certain criteria. An important one is that they needed to not have a preference for matrix clause construal. So in the cases with like when that we saw before where it was ambiguous and either one was okay, a certain percentage of the population they originally tested preferred matrix clause on average, and they took them out because they wanted to control for that. Keep in mind that's always a possibility. Okay. And the non-natives, the JSEs, were controlled for proficiency in English, so that they were of a level, I believe they were intermediates, but I don't remember. The format for the methods, this was an untimed paper and pencil test, literally on paper and pencil. Each item, that is to say every story question with the 3 answers, was on a separate sheet of paper with no possible return to early answers. I think they're flipping through them. Participants were asked to choose all the appropriate answers to the questions. So they would see a context, they'd see 3 answers, they'd say yes, no, no, or no, no, yes, or whatever, and then they'd flip. For the JSEs, the story component was in Japanese to reduce the likelihood that they had misunderstood the story. The questions and answers were in English because we're testing English. And the authors make a note that this came from Despotter et al. In multiple previous. And it's not unprecedented in L2 research. It's still kind of... It brings up some questions methodologically, but for now we're just going to take it at face value. The results. First, let me show you the items. There are 5 items for this task. The items I'm about to show you, C and E, violate attract closest, aka superiority. And then D and E have extractions from islands, aka subjacency violations, which means that A and B are going to be fine. C has a superiority violation, D has a subjacency violation, and E has both, okay? So A should be fine. And in fact, A is just a normal it's the subject movement. Who did the head teacher suspect had taken what? Okay. B has the adjunct. So when did Henry remember when Louise had lost what? So we can have either interpretation. C, this should have a superiority violation, but non-island violation. So who did Sophie's brother warn Sophie would telephone when? And this is what we saw before, where you should have matrix scope on who because of attract closest. D, since when is actually heading our